Good evening. My name is 𝐷𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐬, and I'm the Lillian and James Clark Assistant Curator of European Art at the Dallas Museum of Art. I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual fête celebrating French art of the 18th century, presented by the Michael Rosenberg Foundation. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐼𝐭 Jackal, I want to recognize the trustees of the Rosenberg Foundation, Bob Harrison, Deb O'Gage, and Becky Todd. We are so grateful for the Rosenberg Foundation's generous support of the DMA through the long-term loan of the Foundation's important collection of 18th century French art and its sponsorship of this wonderful annual event. I also want to take a moment to honor the memory of Dr. Larry Barzoun, the former chairman of the Rosenberg Foundation, who passed away this summer. Dr. Barzoun, a longtime advocate for the arts, befriended Michael Rosenberg when Michael had just moved from New Jersey to Dallas. Reflecting his commitment to strengthening Dallas's cultural institutions, from the DMA to the symphony, Dr. Barzoun became a founding member of the Rosenberg Foundation in 1997, where he worked to ensure that music and the visual arts could be enjoyed widely by the citizens of Dallas. It's now my pleasure to welcome tonight's esteemed speaker, Dr. 𝐤𝐤𝐼𝐭 Jackal. Dr. Jackal is the Elizabeth and Alan Sheldon Curator of European Paintings and the Department Head of European Art at the Detroit Institute of Art. Before joining Detroit, Dr. Jackal was Curator of French Paintings and Head of the Curatorial Department at the Wallace Collection in London, where she oversaw numerous initiatives, including a major research and conservation project around Jean-Honoré Fragonard's iconic painting, The Swing. Previously, as the Assistant Curator of French Paintings at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., she curated major exhibitions, including Jean-Honoré Fragonard, The Fantasy Figures, and America Collects 18th Century French Painting. More recently, Dr. Jackal's book on the artist Jean-Baptiste Greuze received the 2023 Prix d'Académie by the Académie Française. Tonight's talk will delve into the formative years of the painter Jacques-Louis David to trace the complex and truly unexpected story of his relationship to the Rococo. Please join me in welcoming 𝐤𝐤𝐼𝐭 to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Annabelle. It is a huge honor for me to be here, and I thank you and Nikki Myers and Sarah Edwards and Shelby Bennett for this invitation and for organizing this wonderful visit. I also want to thank the Michael Rosenberg Foundation for all that it does to invigorate scholarship on 18th century France in this country. My talk today is about possible alignments between the French neoclassical painter, Jacques-Louis David, and the pastel-hued decorative aesthetic style known as the Rococo. David, shown here in his defiant self-portrait of 1794, was a self-styled reformer of both French art and society. In life, he signed the death warrant for Louis XVI. In art, his male heroes occupy worlds of war, while his women are pushed to realms of emotion and domesticity. His most important history paintings, such as the lictors bring to Brutus the bodies of his sons, stand apart for the Spartan severity of their compositions and subdued harmonies of their colors. Depicting the Roman founder, Lucius Junius Brutus, seated stoically in his house as his soldiers carry in the bodies of his children, whom he himself had condemned to death, the lictors celebrates the stark outcome of his choice. Public good must prevail over personal interests. When it was shown in Paris at the Salon of 1789, the painting caused a sensation. Coming as it did only days after the storming of the Bastille prison, David's tense canvas is now considered to embody the new Republican values of its turbulent era. David's paintings chart a radically new direction from the art of the majority of the Ancien Régime. That style is known by names such as the rocaille, le goût moderne, le petit goût, and perhaps most enduringly, the Rococo. It stands apart for its intimacy, elegance, and refinement. Characterized by curvilinear, asymmetrical lines in the three-dimensional decorative arts, one of the greatest expressions of the Rococo in painting is the so-called fête galante, a genre of intimately scaled pictures showing aristocratic individuals engaged in various leisurely pastimes. The Michael Rosenberg Collection features exquisite examples of this style, including Jean-Baptiste Pater's Fête champêtre during the grape harvest, and Nicolas Lancret's concert in the Oval Salon of Pierre Crozat's Château de Montmorency. The protagonists of these pictures appear to thoroughly enjoy themselves as they converse, flirt, gather flowers, promenade. As celebrations of luxury, pleasure, and self-determination, Fête Galante could not be further removed from the populist underpinnings of David's grand neoclassicism. David's students were fully conscious of this aesthetic and political chasm. In his studio, they supposedly took up the rallying cry, 𝑉𝐚𝐿𝑜, Pompadour, Rococo, a list of the key things against which they stood in opposition. Madame de Pompadour had been Louis XV's mistress. Carl Van Loo was one of her favorite artists. The Rococo style was essentially her creation. The neoclassical litany was spoken in rhythmical, almost rhyming terms that mocked the elliptical, decorative quality of the Rococo itself. Subsequently, the Rococo versus neoclassical divide has been carried through in the art historical literature. Scholars who support the Rococo, this group encompasses 19th century writers such as Edmond and Jules de Goncourt, condemned the linear political paintings that they associated with David for having superseded and destroyed the Ancien Régime style that they had cherished. The reverse is also true. Those advocates for neoclassicism tend to describe it as a refreshing palate cleanser after the sickly sweetness of the Rococo. If David is universally considered in these texts as the champion of neoclassicism, those seeking to put a face on the Rococo had an easy time identifying its artistic embodiment. This was none other than Jean-Honoré Fragonard, the creator of the Swing in the Wallace Collection, or the Progress of Love series in the Frick Collection. Like Pater's Fête champêtre, or Lancret's concert in the Oval Salon, Fragonard's paintings depict scenes of seduction and the individual pursuit of pleasure set in lush gardens. And Fragonard goes one step further. His works are rendered in remarkably expressive brushwork that creates a constant sense of restless movement and spontaneity, so different from the rational stillness of neoclassicism. As the embodiment of the Rococo, Fragonard makes a striking appearance in the novel The Gods Will Have Blood by Anatole France, which focuses on the career in the 1790s of a young student of David named Évariste. This ardent young revolutionary describes Fragonard, by now in his 60s, as follows, I quote, "I met him a while ago, the miserable old man, trotting by under the arcades of the Palais Égalité, powdered, genteel, sprightly, spruce, hideous. At sight of him, I longed that failing Apollo, some sturdy friend of the arts might hang him up to a tree and flay him alive, like Marsyas, as an everlasting warning to bad painters." Fragonard is here cast as an aged, broken-down caricature of one of his own painted heroes, almost as if the young man from the Swing had grown old and found his way out of the frame and into the harsh light of the revolutionary era. Surprisingly, David himself does not seem to have shared the oppositional viewpoint of his fictive student. In fact, during the last decades of the 18th century, in the bracing aftermath of the revolution, there are multiple points at which David went out of his way to show respect for Fragonard. In turn, David's actions seem to have emerged out of and been motivated by a longer-term professional relationship, even a friendship between the two artists. This talk considers 3 key moments or encounters in this friendship that, when taken together, create a context for a rapprochement of styles. Thanks to his interactions with Fragonard, David had opportunities to engage with the Rococo, and I believe that he responded creatively, with surprising moments of both fusion and evolution that can be charted in his painting. So, encounter number 1, the Chaussée d'Antin in the 1770s. The March 1773 issue of the Correspondance littéraire, a widely circulated cultural chronicle, contained a startling news item. Fragonard and the famous dancer Mademoiselle 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐪 had had a fight so bitter that the painter had withdrawn from the high-profile job of decorating the salon de compagnie of her splendid new home. This was located, as is shown here on the map, just here where the star is, in the midst of the fashionable Parisian neighborhood of the Chaussée d'Antin, in the present-day 9th arrondissement. Mademoiselle 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐪's Hôtel Particulier was conceived to resemble a neoclassical jewel box, as is shown here. Its interior was intended to celebrate the Greek goddess 𝐃𝐚𝐯𝐢, a sentimental choice because 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐪 had made her stage debut in 1762 under the guise of this muse of dance. And the interior decor is also referenced in this painting, in this drawing, in which a bevy of classically dressed women cluster in the landscape near the house. So they are over here. According to the Correspondance, Fragonard had only gotten as far as laying in sketches for the 4 large panels destined to decorate the Salon de Compagnie. Following his exodus, another painter was called in to complete the salon. This was none other than the young David, aged all of 25 years old and still a student at the 𝐵école des élèves protégés. In one fell swoop, David had inherited his first major commission for Paris society, and for no less glamorous a patron than one of the shining stars of the Paris Opera. 8 months later, in November 1773, Jean-Baptiste Marie Pierre, first painter to the king, weighed in with his perspective. Pierre confirmed that Fragonard had indeed only gotten to the stage of laying in sketches for the wall panels. He shed light on the origins of the disagreement, which had supposedly arisen because Fragonard felt that 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐪 was underpaying him for what was a significant amount of work. But he also implied that 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐪 would have been within her contractual rights to force Fragonard to finish out the work that had been mutually agreed upon. Finally, the first painter suggested that Fragonard had been complacent about the choice of David, and that David was rendering Fragonard a service by stepping up to finish out the work for Mademoiselle 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐼. In other words, a cordial relationship based upon mutual aid seems to have existed between the two artists. Of all the available artists in Paris, why did Mademoiselle 𝐉𝐚𝐜𝐼's choice fall on one then so junior as David? I want to suggest that Fragonard was not just complacent about this selection, but that he played an active role in promoting this outcome. For this to have happened, Fragonard would, of course, have had to know David, and certainly this is very likely. They shared an important connection in the figure of François Boucher, who was both Fragonard's former teacher and David's second cousin. In his handwritten autobiography, David recalled meeting Boucher for the first time in 1764, when his uncle, François Boucher, had drawn upon the family connection to promote David's prospects in the Parisian art world. Boucher had professed himself too elderly to take on David's training, but helped to place him with an appropriate teacher. In addition to being personally aware of David, Fragonard would have had to feel respect for the young artist's talent and abilities. One picture that may have helped Fragonard to make up his mind is Apollo and Diana attacking the children of Niobe. David completed this splendid canvas in 1772, only 1 year prior to taking up Mademoiselle Guimar's commission. Apollo and Diana clearly differs from the cool restraint of David's later history paintings. In its color palette and creamy brushwork applied to a dynamic, chaotic scene, it is much more in line with works such as The Rising and Setting of the Sun by Boucher. Unexpectedly, David's painting also engages with contemporary French society in a way that Fragonard would surely have found appealing. Drawn from Ovid's Metamorphoses, David's painting represents the fate of 𝐼𝐿𝐵e, a mortal woman who has rashly suggested that she was a better, more fertile mother than the goddess Latona. Apollo and Diana, Latona's children, exact a terrible price for this slight to their mother's reputation. One by one, the two young gods kill off every one of 𝐼𝐿𝐵E's 7 daughters and 7 sons. At the heart of the tale is a concern with the shortcomings of maternal love. It is 𝐼𝐿𝐵e, through her misplaced vanity, who brings disaster upon her family. This lesson would have resonated with contemporary viewers for a reason that feels surprising to us today. Starting in the 18th century, there was a strong social and intellectual backlash against the widespread practice of sending children away from the home to be raised by wet nurses. Breastfeeding one's own children was typically considered too menial a task to be undertaken by wealthy and aristocratic women. But it was increasingly apparent that children sent to the wet nurse suffered high mortality rates. And if they were lucky enough to one day return home, living and disease-free, they found themselves estranged from their own parents, having never had an opportunity to develop a natural bond. Enlightenment philosophers thus urged women not to allow their vanity to destroy their families by relying upon this unnatural practice. Visual artists also weighed in. The painter Jean-Baptiste Greuze glorified the joys of maternal breastfeeding in numerous paintings. It is likely, in fact, that the dreamer in the Michael Rosenberg collection does not, as has been suggested, represent a sexualized expression. Rather, this woman with her entranced, rapturous gaze should be considered in relation to Greuze's depictions of happy mothers who have nobly undertaken to nurse their own young, as in the fulfilled titular figure of La Mère Bien-Aimée, shown here. All of the hopeful contenders for the 1772 Prix de Rome tackled the same set subject. But it is interesting to note that David explored the link between maternity and breastfeeding more explicitly than his peers. The prize winner, Pierre-Charles Jombert, shows the unfortunate 𝐼𝐿𝐵e decorously clothed, as does Anicet Charles Gabriel Lemonnier. So those are the paintings on the left and then in the center of my slide. The 𝐼𝐿𝐵e represented in the third surviving painting, this is a work that has been given to either Jean-Pierre Bidot or the obscure artist known to us today only as Long. She is more disheveled, but her bust is only partially uncovered. David is alone in having chosen to show 𝐼𝐿𝐵e with her breast fully exposed, and this serves as a subtle reminder of the unbreakable bond created between mother and child from the very moment an infant begins to nurse. Ultimately, of course, this bond makes 𝐼𝐿𝐵E's fate all the more tragic. David may certainly have been looking at Greuze, but there is another artist who tackled this subject memorably as well, in works such as Roman Interior, showing a happily bonded mother and child in the very center of the composition, and The Visit to the Nursery, depicting an aristocratic couple paying a visit to their young baby, in which the nurse occupies the mother's natural place at the side of the cradle, and the mother does not even bother to sit down as she inspects her child. The link may also be borne out in aesthetic terms. It is interesting to note that the figures of 𝐼𝐿𝐵e, in both the unattributed painting and in David's canvas, are strikingly similar. as the terms of the Prix de Rome competition dictated that all paintings be made at the same time under highly controlled conditions, this might suggest that both contenders drew from their memories of a common third source. And indeed, there is a curious similarity with both Niobe's and the heroic figure of Fragonard's 𝐾𝐳 and 𝐾𝐳. All three are upright, arms thrown outward, fingers strikingly splayed. So I'm talking about this figure here, 𝐾𝐳 in Fragonard's painting, and of course the central Niobe in David's painting. Fragonard's painting, which had secured his entry into the Royal Academy and caused a sensation at the Salon of 1765, would have been an obvious model for these aspiring artists. It is also worth asking what a commission conceived by Fragonard and finished by an eager David might have looked like. We cannot know for certain because the whereabouts of the decorations made for 𝐷𝐸 are currently unknown. The panels were still in the house in 1786, the year in which 𝐷𝐸 went bankrupt and auctioned off her belongings. However, in December 1846, they were removed from their setting and sold as a group, and subsequently they have disappeared from view. But we do have the contemporaneous Frick pictures, which provide a clear sense of how Fragonard approached a very similar commission made at a very similar date. We also have 4 drawings by Fragonard showing dancing, classically dressed figures, one of which bore the inscription 𝑇ℎ𝑒 on an old mount, thereby confirming a relationship with the Muse of Dance. This was, of course, the subject of Fragonard's commission for 𝐷𝐸. Moreover, each of Fragonard's drawn figures possesses a monumental quality that explicitly recall the figures in the Progress of Love panels and suggest that the drawings were made in preparation for a large wall design. We also have a series of clues that imply that, for his part, David managed to carry out his predecessor's vision without a hitch. First, there is the catalog of the 1846 sale, which described the large panels as the most seductive works imaginable and attributed them to Fragonard alone. Second, there is a drawing by David in the École nationale des beaux-arts that is likely to be related. It features 2 conversing figures set in a landscape, one of whom recalls Fragonard's drawing of a woman with a lyre. Finally, around the same time, David made a life-sized, full-length portrait of Mademoiselle 𝐷𝐸, showing her dressed in the costume of a shepherdess from the opera. Represented in the act of trying out a dance step, she adopts a pose very similar to that of one of Fragonard's drawn figures. David seems to have been pleased with this effort, and he listed it in the handwritten catalog that he made of his paintings. This document makes no mention of Fragonard, but the latter's influence is nonetheless palpable. The cloudy violet sky rising above Mademoiselle 𝐷𝐸's powdered hair and pink bonnet is strikingly similar to that in Fragonard's Blind Man's Buff at the National Gallery of Art, Washington. In the thickly dotted flowers and foliage of his portrait, David appears to attempt to approximate the lush effect of Fragonard's Progress of Love landscapes. Significantly, David's opinion of the whole experience of stepping in for Fragonard remained enduringly positive. It is said that David returned to 𝐷𝐸's house in 1786 to touch up his decorative panels, an action that he is unlikely to have taken if he wished to distance himself from them artistically. It was in this year that 𝐷𝐸 auctioned off her collection. David seems to have purchased at this very sale his own representation of the dancer as a shepherdess. The portrait of 𝐷𝐸 was definitely in his studio in 1799, when David showed it to a pupil, remarking that, I quote, "It was always agreeable to him because it reminded him of a truly generous protector." So those are the words of his student. Encounter number 2, the Louvre in the 1780s. In 1775, Following his initial brush with the Rococo, David went to Italy. There, he responded to the clarity and monumentality of classicism by developing a style that privileged simplicity and directness. Nonetheless, although his art did indeed look very different when he returned to France in July 1780, it is not accurate to say that all traces of the Rococo fully dropped out of his work thereafter. As the late Anne Schroeder has pointed out, Fragonard and David lived next door to each other, starting early in 1782, the year in which David inherited the Louvre apartment and studio that had once belonged to Boucher. And this neighborly proximity remained in place up through the early 1790s. The location of their two lodgings, situated on the Cour Carrée side of the Louvre, are shown here, where my star is located. And also, I will just point out as a point of interest that this map is so good that we can actually see just below where the star is located, that would be the point at which some men put a ladder going up to the Louvre just recently. So it's amazing how much Paris has not changed. It was unusual for so newly established an artist to receive space in the Louvre, and David had certainly advocated long and hard among his contacts to make this happen. But in addition to representing a consecration in and of itself, his move must also have opened up new professional vistas and new ways of thinking. Logically, relocating into the heady environment of the Louvre resulted in closer contact with a number of artists, especially those whose lodgings were clustered around the door in the center of the colonnade wing, namely Guy-Nicolas Brunet, Pierre-Antoine Desmachis, and most importantly, Fragonard. In turn, the renewal of contact with Fragonard must have solidified the respectful relationship that had emerged in the 1770s, when David worked to fulfill Mademoiselle Guillemard's commission. While his actions then were those of a novice, bent on carrying out Fragonard's vision to the letter, the professionally astute David had a different reason for emulating Fragonard now. Even though Fragonard had pulled away from the biennial Salon exhibitions, he still remained a painter to watch. In the 1780s, Fragonard was at the very height of his influence on the art market. In fact, in 1785, a painting that he had made 10 years earlier, The Adoration of the Shepherds, achieved a career record price of 9,501 livres at public auction. This was a huge figure that established him as one of the most expensive artists living. Simultaneously, reproductions of his compositions were immensely popular on Paris's thriving print market. The year in which David moved into the Louvre, 1782, saw the swing issued as a print. The renewed popularity of these compositions, each about an aspect of love, whether divine or profane, may in fact have inspired David. Starting in the mid-1780s, he began work on a series of compositions relating to the theme of love. Love is triumphant in Paris and Helen, a minutely detailed, sensuously colored rendering in which Paris has discarded his weapons and sits ready to serenade the beautiful Helen. David's painting was destined for Louis XVI's younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, possibly for his pleasure pavilion, Bagatelle. The Comte was known for his numerous love affairs. Scholars have noted the similarities between Paris's bedchamber, as depicted by David, and d'Artois' sumptuous bedroom in Bagatelle, which was decorated to approximate a luxurious military tent. Around the same time, David made the Vestal, a portrait-sized depiction of a priestess of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and protectress of Rome. The Vestal sits in front of a copper vessel decorated with a lion's head, in which smolders the sacred fire that must never be allowed to go out. Her transparent white robes signify the fact that she has consecrated her life to this ancient Roman cult. With her eyes lifted imploringly, David's Vestal appears in the throes of emotion. there is a clear connection to the art of Greuze, who in the 18th century reformulated and popularized the expressive codes laid down by Charles 𝐕 in the 17th century. Moreover, in 1773, David had carried off the prize in the competition for the best expressive head, which was designed to reward young artists for their study of 𝐕's precepts. David revisited the same theme in about 1780 in the work now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, with the head of a young woman wearing a turban who raises her eyes heavenward with an expression of profound grief. In this case, though, the emotion experienced by David's Vestal seems to be provoked by the contents of the document on her lap, which she has presumably just finished reading. Caught in the throes of her reverie, she's forgetful of the flame in the vessel behind her, and the rising cloud of white smoke suggests that it is on the point of extinction. Contemporary literary sources dwelt upon the existential dilemmas faced by Rome's guardians, so it seems reasonable to suppose that the Vestal has just received a letter from her lover and is shown in the moment of hesitation between the temptations of mortal love and her sworn duty to the cult of Vesta. The inherent meditation on the dangers of love is made even more apparent by the Vestal's association with another, possibly unfinished, painting that David would later title a half-length abandoned Psyche. David repeatedly described these two identically sized representations of individual female figures as pendants in inventories that he drew up at the end of his life. It is possible that Psyche was made after the Vestal, since there is a clear difference in paint handling between the two works. But their thematic affinity points to them having been planned together, with the Vestal completed first, and Psyche definitely finished by 1795 when Madame David made reference to it being in her husband's studio. Together, the two works illustrate the potentially devastating effects of mortal passion. The Vestal has not yet succumbed to profane love, but the abandoned Psyche has just lost her Cupid and sits alone and desolate. In making these two works, David may have sought formal inspiration in the painting of Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun. In costume and accessories, the Vestal appears to draw upon her portrait of Madame de la Rochefoucauld, particularly in the rendering of the translucent white veil drawn over powdered curls. And for the slightly solid, monumental figure of his Psyche, David seems to have been inspired by Vigée's voluptuous Bacchante, which had been shown at the Salon of 1785. But thematically, David's love paintings might rather be said to respond to a series of works by Fragonard, the allegories of love in which the transporting effects of this emotion are explored alongside the sorrow that comes with its loss. In one painting, two eager lovers think only of drinking from the waters of love, prefiguring the lyrical entwinement of Paris and Helen, both oblivious to the Trojan War raging outside his tent. The Vestal finds a counterpart in the Sacrifice of Love, in which a girl has just laid her rose, that is her virginity, on a burning altar, thereby giving it up in service to the awe-inspiring emotion that seems already to have overwhelmed her. Finally, a devastating sense of despair envelops the female figure in The Invocation to Love. She rushes forward, pleading for assistance from the statue of Eros, the blindfolded and indifferent god of love. Surely this transporting emotion foreshadows Psyche's mute helplessness. If David was looking closely at Fragonard at this period, is it possible that the reverse might be true? It is difficult to say. Fragonard's commercial celebrity was at its apex, and it would not be until some years later, during the Revolution, that David was truly in a position to help Fragonard. But, of course, in the 1780s, David was still a rising star, as well as a colleague and neighbor. Here is one possible scenario. We know that numerous artists sought out David's advice, not just his students, but also his peers. For example, in 1787, Vigée-Lebrun asked David how he would envisage posing Marie Antoinette and her children. By way of response, David suggested that she look toward prints after Raphael and seek to emulate the triangular organization of a Holy Family. Perhaps this documented exchange provides a blueprint for other exchanges. Fragonard must have made his delicate souvenir just before it was engraved in 1786. It is difficult to imagine a more Rococo work than this. The combination of the rose-colored silk dress in the verdant forest environment evokes the genre of the fête galante. Moreover, the painting depicts an action, carving a lover's name into a tree, that was linked to a specifically Baroque source, the episode in Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, in which Angelica joyously carves her lover Medoro's name on a tree. On the surface, then, this tiny painting has nothing in common with the works that David was showing at the Salon at this time, such as the Oath of the Horatii. And yet, the girl's poignant desire to preserve the memory of something that was by nature fleeting, love, inevitably recalls another famous image. This is the Chatsworth version of Nicolas Poussin's Et in Arcadio Ego, which had been engraved in 1763. Could David, whose love of Poussin was well documented, have suggested the composition to Fragonard? We know in any case that Fragonard wanted to highlight the sober side of his heroine's solitary activity, rather than allude to the celebratory type of action taken by Angelica, who makes her carving with her lover Medoro by her side. Some years later, when Fragonard revisited the theme of abandonment in the final panel added to his Progress of Love series, he seems to have had the souvenir in mind. The dresses worn by the two female figures are almost exactly identical. We also know that Fragonard had sufficient faith in David's abilities to entrust him with a very personal matter. In September 1792, Fragonard's only son, the 12-year-old Alexandre Évariste, began to train as a painter under the tutelage of David. Encounter number 3, David's studio circa 1795. Starting in 1789, David took an increasingly hostile attitude towards many of the artists whom he had admired, emulated, and frequented in the years leading up to and during the Revolution. For example, he criticized his former friend Vigée Lebrun as a social climber who had obsequiously placed her portraiture at the service of the aristocracy. She, in turn, accused him of obsessively spreading false rumors that she was having an affair with the unpopular Minister of Finance, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. According to Vigée Lebrun, David's behavior during the Revolution verged upon barbarism, as he ruthlessly persecuted many of their former colleagues, including the painter of landscapes and ruins, Hubert Robert, represented in Dallas with an especially beautiful work from the Michael Rosenberg Collection. David is also supposed to have had a hand in the death in 1794 of Émilie Chalgrin, the daughter of the marine painter Joseph Vernet. He refused to intercede in her fate, despite the personal request of her brother Carl Vernet, who had been David's neighbor in the Louvre. Yet David did not abandon Fragonard, and this is a fact worth noting, given that Fragonard himself had stepped away from the academic realm early in his career in order to cater to a moneyed class of collectors, a shift that had, in the eyes of many art critics, cemented his association with the elitism of the Ancien Régime. Thus, David's attitude seems to have been something of a choice. Why did he continue to cultivate this relationship when Fragonard could so easily have expected similar treatment to that endured by his friends, Hubert Robert, who was imprisoned and nearly guillotined, or Vigée Lebrun, who fled France in 1789? I want to suggest that the answer lies in the fact that, for Fragonard and David, the personal and professional had become deeply enmeshed. In October 1792, David lobbied the Ministry of the Interior for a spacious new apartment in the Louvre for Fragonard, who was back in Paris after a short stay in the south of France. David's request was made in strong terms. I quote, "What isn't widely known are Fragonard's good morals and those of his respectable family. I compare them to the simple and patriarchal ones of our first fathers," end quote. The following year, David recommended Fragonard for the role of curator at the new National Museum, the future Musée du Louvre. Here again, David was unstinting in his praise. So again, I quote, "Passion and originality are what characterize Fragonard. Simultaneously an expert and a great artist, he will devote his old age to stewarding the body of masterworks to which he added in his youth." End quote. And finally, in 1785, David wrote a personal, in 1805, David wrote a personal note of thanks to Alexandre Évariste, his former student, in return for the gift of an unnamed work of art. So here again is David speaking. "I'm grateful, my good friend, for your thoughtfulness. It shows me that you remember me. I received with great joy your work, and I felt an incredible pleasure in looking at it. Continue, my dear friend. You were born to go far. When one makes something like this at the age of only 24, one must be happy. I congratulate your good father. I wish him the complete liberty that he left you in the arts, because he knew wisely that there were many possible paths, and now the name Fragonard will be distinguished in all genres. I send a warm hug to your tender mother." Not only does David admire Fragonard in this quote, but he also clearly evinces warm admiration for his abilities as a parent. In fact, David's words serve as an important reminder. While the professional implications of the 1782 move into the Louvre have been acknowledged, the personal impact of the living situation has not yet been closely studied. But the presence of families would inevitably have made personal contact that much more likely. Fragonard was 15 years David's senior, but Fragonard's wife, Marianne, was only 3 years older than David. In the 1780s, the two artists would have had another personal point in common as well. Fragonard's second child, his son Alexandre Évariste, was born in late 1780, so David had essentially watched him grow up before he took him on as a student. Meanwhile, David's oldest son, Jules, entered the world only a few years later at the beginning of 1783. In art, the personal and the professional may have begun to converge in the late 1780s. In the final years of the decade, David painted a portrait of Jules, then aged 4 or 5. The little boy wears an oversized white shirt with a ruffle at the neck. This outfit appears to be that of the Commedia dell'arte figure of Pierrot. It was not typical to put a child in the role of the lovesick clown, but Fragonard had done exactly the same thing in his own charming painting of the late 1770s. This painting inspired a series of miniatures by Marianne Fragonard, so David likely had the opportunity to see Fragonard's composition in some iteration. The two works bear close similarities, not only in costume, but also in their evocative handling. In both instances, the contrast between the tender brushwork applied to the model's hair with the vigorous scumbling in the background creates a haunting sense of immediacy. David is well known for his portraiture, which he made successfully from early in his career, moving from painting portraits of his friends and family in the 1760s and 1770s to taking full advantage of the lucrative possibilities of portraiture with a series of grand portrayals of social celebrities in the 1780s, to realizing portraits of Napoleonic dignitaries during the Consulate and Empire. However, he seems to have felt a certain discomfort with the subservient behavior inherently expected of a successful society portraitist. In this regard, Philippe Borde has suggested that David's bitter attacks on Vigée Lebrun in the late 1780s may have been motivated by his own self-loathing, because it was in precisely those years that David, in serving as a portraitist to Paris society, had exhibited many of the behaviors he criticized. This may explain why, whenever he was able to assert himself, David tended to embrace a restrained format in his portraiture, training his focus on figures set against a neutral background. These works included few accessories, in line with Enlightenment thinking that it was better to privilege the model's innate character over the representation of their social position or worldly accoutrements. they also appear calibrated to strike a tone of social informality. Here too, David found, if not direct inspiration, at least a compelling point of comparison in Fragonard's figures de fantaisie, or fantasy figures. These are paintings of similar dimensions that Fragonard made around 1769, supposedly each one in only 1 hour's time. They're rendered in a brilliant color palette using gestural brushwork. With one exception, they depict frontally facing figures clad in the elaborate masquerade dress, rough collars, costume jewelry, that was known in the 18th century as Spanish fashion. The leveling effects of Fragonard's clothing choice have become apparent now that we know that some of his sitters belonged to the echelons of France's highest nobility, others were jobbing artists, publishers, printmakers, and book dealers. In Fragonard's hands, they are all the same. Like David after him, Fragonard was more focused upon capturing the essence of his sitters' personalities than in documenting their social status. The 18th century whereabouts of Fragonard's brilliant series remains a mystery, but some of his paintings came onto the art market as early as the 1770s. One of them inspired Vigée Lebrun's performative portrait of Madame de Perregaux in 1789. And David certainly seems to have had Fragonard in mind in circa 1812, when he turned yet again to the subject of his family. His daughters, Émilie and Pauline, and Émilie's husband, Claude-Marie Meunier. As in the portrait of his son, executed some 25 years prior, the models are posed frontally in intimate, informal poses. Their identical salmon-colored dresses gesture toward the fact that the girls were twins, but the real unifying force between the two works is the bold brushwork, so thin and raw in places that scholars have wondered whether they are indeed finished. Nonetheless, the virtuoso paint handling in different areas of the portrait of Émilie, the skin of her bust is porcelain-like, the carefully applied pale highlights in the dress suggest the texture of velvet, support the theory that this fluid, energetic brushwork was not intended to be covered up. This is further borne out by examination of David's portrait of Claude-Marie. Here, too, the artist brought in an experimental approach to his paint handling. The energetic application of paint in the face of this Napoleonic officer gives liveliness to the austere features, while the scumbled effect in the blues of the uniform contrasts with the lush fluidity of the gold braid decoration. In these family effigies, brushwork and coloring are placed at the service of mood, personality, and individuality. As in Fragonard's fantasy figures, one feels the presence of the artist as much as the model, and that creates a strong sense of intimacy that David uses to great effect. Of course, he was by then Napoleon's first painter. Such informality was really only possible in experimental works such as these, made in his studio and for a private purpose. David later gifted the portraits to his daughters as an enduring token of his affection. Conclusion. In 1816, David was banished from France by the Bourbon government for having voted the death of Louis XVI and for having championed Napoleon. He spent the last 9 years of his life living in Brussels. He remained intensely productive, continuing to make portraits and history paintings. This time around, though, his history paintings no longer glorified the harsh discipline of battle. Rather, in elegant, pleasing works such as Cupid and Psyche and The Farewell of Telemachus and Eucharis, David returned to the complications of love. David's wife linked this renewed romantic focus to the peace of mind they had found away from the turbulent politics of France. She wrote, "We are blessed with tranquility that we have not known for so long. Monsieur David has devoted himself completely to his dear painting, and since we've been here, his genius has settled only on graceful compositions." Some years later, the anger of Achilles and Mars disarmed by Venus and the Graces continue in the same vein. A melancholy Achilles recalls the loss of his fiancée, Iphigenia, shown in the background. David's final painting, Mars disarmed by Venus, brings this late love cycle to its natural conclusion in this massive composition that affirms the power of love over war. Just after finishing Cupid and Psyche in 1817, David began thinking about the composition of Mars disarmed by Venus. He may have conceived it as a sort of antidote to Cupid and Psyche, this time showing the woman dominating the man, writing the betrayal enacted in the first scene. If he had once conceived of Psyche as abandoned and despairing, this time he was intent upon giving her a happier ending. There are also echoes of his 1787 Vestal, notably in the resigned figure of Iphigenia and in the Graces who celebrate Venus's ultimate triumph. Perhaps the Vestal's haunting recurrence in David's last work offers a final argument to see his conception of Rococo and Neoclassicism not so much as a relationship of opposition, but as one of exchange, a sort of artistic waltz between two movements spinning cautiously toward modernity. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
You mentioned that, what was his name, for something or other? Sorry, I'm really bad with names.
No worries. So which, maybe tell me a little more about...
The older painter.
Oh, Fragonard?
Fragonard,
Yeah.
that was what it was. You mentioned that his son ended up training under David.
Yes.
I'm interested to know, did Fragonard's son, did he end up taking on more after his father or after David in his art style?
Well, I think he took after David more, probably for, first, we have David's quote to that effect in the letter that David writes to Alexandre Évariste, the son, where he says, you know, your father let you go, follow your path, and, you know, now you're sort of, there's, I think the way I read that is that he feels that Alexandre Évariste has fallen more, you know, in the sort of Davidian school, and that Fragonard had let him go because that was his, you know, sort of desire. That being said, you know, Alexandre Évariste made his mark as an illustrator as much as a painter, and that was an area in which Fragonard had also established himself. So, you know, maybe it's sort of in between the two.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question about the Hotel Particulier of the opera singer.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was important for that first meeting, and you said that the Fragonard was complacent in getting David that assignment, and I don't know if the word complicit was the word I was looking for. Was that something that he sort of engineered? And then my other question is, do those paintings still exist? And does the Hotel Particulier still exist? And did you mention that that opera singer then went bankrupt and had to sell everything?
So yes. To take your question sort of backwards, yes, she had to sell everything in 1786. She went bankrupt, and she auctioned off her house and its contents. The house did survive for some time, but was ultimately demolished, so sadly it does not exist anymore, which is a shame because I think it looks very beautiful. The contents of the house were emptied, and so, you know, we have the paintings being listed as being in the house in 1786, and the next time we find them is in the mid-19th century, when they are auctioned again. It's not totally clear where they were between the late 18th century and the mid-19th century, but the auction catalog is quite useful because it gives the dimensions of these works, and it also gives some description. And as I mentioned in my talk, it tells us that at this point they are considered just by Fragonard. So we can kind of assume that even though David had stepped in on them, he clearly had done had been able to emulate Fragonard's style in seamless enough a manner that the attribution was given to Fragonard. In terms of Fragonard, so we don't know for certain that Fragonard, said to Mademoiselle Guimard, okay, take this artist, this is your man. But there are enough, kind of clues that tell us that they maintained a good relationship. We have Pierre's letter, where he is basically suggesting that David had helped Fragonard out by helping him kind of get off the hook for this contract that he didn't want to finish. And we know that there is a sort of prior knowledge of the two because they both have this deep connection to François Boucher. So that's where I'm suggesting that Fragonard is, sort of both complacent, but also maybe has a bit of a hand in helping, throw David this commission, which ended up being quite important for his career at this early stage.
Thank you so much for your talk. This was so interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but I will just ask one about the portrait by David of Mademoiselle Guimard that you showed from 1773. I'm not sure how much you can say about it. I know it's in a private collection, but I just wondered if you could talk more about that painting, like where you found it, who has it been attributed to in the past, what do we know about its history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. So in the art historical literature, there have been a number of schools of thought around this painting because at different points it has been thought that it could have been two hands, like the panels themselves, that maybe Fragonard and David collaborated. More recently, the painting came up for auction just sort of about like 10 years ago. And at that point, a study was done to really try to understand, and unpack whether it was David or Fragonard or a bit of both. And the conclusion was that it was a painting by one hand. And of course, we have to sort of support that, that it's just one artist painting it. We do have this memoir from David's student who saw the painting in David's studio in the late 18th century. At the very end of the 18th century, David has it. He seems to have bought it at Mademoiselle Guimard's sale when she went bankrupt. And David says, oh, this is such a great memory for me. I love looking at this painting because it really reminds me of this this important patron who is Mademoiselle Guimard. And generally from that, we understand that he has a positive kind of view on the whole experience. And significantly, David, according to the student, does not mention Fragonard. He says, I made this. So that, I think, kind of helps to solidify this theory that it is just David. But I definitely find them so similar. It really is David looking at Fragonard. And again, that gives us a sense of what the panels must have looked like, because if he made this portrait as, sort of, he is trying to sort of emulate or paint in the mood of Fragonard, then, of course, that really kind of upholds this idea that the panels themselves, although we don't have them accessible to, confirm, that they must have been, very similarly painted to what Fragonard had originally set out to do.
We have one final question.
Could you briefly tell how the Fragonards would have gotten in the Wallace collection?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the Wallace Collection, it's a the family of the Marquises of Hartford. There was, I'm just trying to go back to the. Oh, here we go. So there was one member of the family, the fourth Marquis of Hartford, who loved 18th century French painting. And it was he who acquired the bulk of these works. So, the Wallace has many great paintings, but I would say, sort of roughly, the Dutch paintings came through the 3rd Marquis of Hertford. The French paintings are really through the 4th Marquis of Hertford. There's also a very kind of specific collector's taste in these works that I think is very sort of interesting and sort of funny because obviously 18th century France, there are a lot of different facets. David is a partially an 18th century artist. And the 4th Marquis of Hertford only liked paintings to do with love and attractive women. And so he did not acquire any David. It's a very kind of specific taste. But he did have great taste for Fragonard. All of the Fragonards in the Wallace collection, including the swing, came from him. Thank you.